Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from as we TriCast on three different platforms. Jason, today is episode 90. That is a 9 and then a 0
Zero.
somewhere in there. So we're sneaking up on 100. It's been doing this now, 2+ years.
Yeah.
World Backup Day 2 years ago, March 31st, 2020 was our first run at this. And we've been running hard ever since. One of the things we love to do, Jason, is a little bit of discussion, occasionally a little bit of myth busting. We take a few facts, we riff on them. Today's no exception. But before we jump into that, how you doing? How's your weekend?
I had a great weekend. I got a chance to spend some time in church, had naps on both Saturday and Sunday,
Nice.
and of course the obligatory holiday meal. So, it's hard to fault that. You?
Yeah, I'm kind of right with you there, especially the holiday meal part. Breakfast after holiday is always really nice because, of course, it's just heat up some of that great stuff you had during the weekend, which is always awesome. So let's dive into our first bit of content and kind of unpack some of this. We've used some of these stats in the past, but we're going to kind of put them in a new light. And in some cases, we've got some new data to share with you. Before we do, though, just want to give a shout out. Please join in on the comments. Tell us where you may be tuning in from. We do like to hit the world map. I'm in Colorado. Jason's in Texas. Our producer is in Georgia. We already have someone joining us from the Northeast, which is our boss, Danny. Welcome. And we've got production support typically in Romania, but today Catrinel is in Malaga, Spain. I was chatting with her about last time I was in Malaga. I had great sardines on the ocean coast there. So it's instead of -1, she was saying, Jason, a little more warm and comfortable. And we already have Slovakia joining us as well. So thank you for that. We'll be referring to this from time to time. I'll give a little comment. And if you have any questions or comments about what we might be chatting about, feel free to jump in with that as well. So let's hit a little content. Oh, it looks like you're going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, one of the things I love about the fact that even 2 years later, we're still doing this live is, there's a lot of weeks that we have series that are planned. And so, we try to share data over 3, 4, 5 weeks and get a conversation going. And I love all the conversation that we get on Twitter and LinkedIn that comes after these events along the way. But because we do it live, occasionally when new stuff breaks in the industry, new reports get published, we get a chance to just jump right in while the news is hot and share it. And Dave, this is stuff that you've uncovered through some of your data mining and such on new data. So I'm looking forward to responding to this in real time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's check out our first graphic if we could. And what you see here, this looks busy, but it's really not. We can decompose it for you. This just came out last week from Gartner. You can see the attribution there in the bottom corner. And what this is looking at is they track now the backup and replication market for years. And by years, I mean like 20+ years. Gartner focused on backup software. They would report that. Last year, they switched to be similar to IDC. They track backup software as well as replication software. And Jason, the rationale around that was that it's getting more and more difficult to distinguish between the two. You can use multiple different techniques to go and capture the data. But right away, look at the big number. It was a 9.85. So if we're rounding, basically a 9.9, sneaking up on a $10 billion software only. There's no hardware in here.
Yep.
But almost 9.9 billion last year, 2021, was spent on backup and replication software. So right off the bat, a little myth busting that backup is dead. No one's doing backup. Almost $10 billion and just in software is getting spent on that. And we always like to talk about hardware drag. And, for those not familiar with that, maybe decompose what is hardware drag in the sense of backup software?
Well, so, certainly if you sell a complete stack, right? So let's say you're I'm a dedupe disk array vendor. Well, you got to need something to feed it, right? A dedupe disk array just sitting on your data center doesn't do nothing unless you feed it with some kind of software. And so it's not uncommon that some vendors will actually sell a complete stack. which you might just consider someone ran setup.next for you. But whatever it is, they built a stack, and then when they report their numbers out to Gartner and then other analyst firms that want to be Gartner, they have to break that out and try to figure out how much of that they're going to count as software revenue along the way. But make no mistakes, what they're in the business of doing is selling a hardware stack. This is just the thing you got to use to feed it. But I love the fact that this is now a backup and replication market, right? Because as you said, really the days that backup alone is sufficient those are long gone, right? Yeah. I mean, and it really, if you argued about it, it should be the backup and replication and snapshot, and if you want to call continuous data protection a variant of some combination of those, that is holistic data protection. And I love the fact that the market measures that in a software only offering.
Yeah. And really quick, while not representing this chart, I should mention that the growth of the market, according to Gartner, from 2020 to 2021 is actually up 6.2%. So that number is expected to be above $10 billion at the end of this current calendar year. And the CY just means calendar year. So if we do a little bit around the horn here.
Make sure to keep that number, write that number down, 6.2%. We're going to come back to that before the end of our session.
Oh, good point. 6.21 if you really want to get nerdy and take another decimal point in there. So if we just check this out, Jason, if you go clockwise, Veritas, according to Gartner's data, is the largest supplier of backup and replication software. I will just pause there, not trying to be snarky, but just make the observation that 17 years in a row, Veritas has been the largest supplier, according to Gartner data, but actually losing share overall now for over a decade and a half, meaning 17 years. Dell EMC at number 2, as you can see, Veeam number 3, as you can see, then IBM, NetApp, and you can kind of go around the horn. Gartner's still unique as compared to another data source we'll look at here shortly, in that they list actually 15 named vendors before they get to their other vendor category. But Jason, I liked one of your comments when I shared this with you last week, and that is there's not a lot of separation between the top 3 vendors, are there?
No, there's actually a couple different areas in this when you look at the deltas that I think are super exciting. Certainly, if you look at between first place and third place on this chart, you're right at 2 percentage points between first, second, and third, right? So it's a pretty congested heat for, let's call it, top of market. And I don't mind saying that, especially considering the fact that you've already mentioned that, the number 1 slot, they continue to erode. And frankly, if I'm in the number 1 slot and I'm barely a percentage point above the number 2, I mean, that's starting to get into fuzzy territory. But yeah, so 2% between first and third space. So nice tight race up at the top. There's a whole nother 2 and a little bit percent between third, which is Veeam, and fourth. There's another nearly 2% between fourth going to fifth, and another 2% from fifth to sixth. So you see those really big gaps. You can imagine, like in a marathon, you see those first 3 runners and they're kind of keeping up with each other at a nice pace. And then there's that fourth place, and then fifth is back a ways, and sixth, you can have to squint, or he's not around the turn yet. And then seventh and beyond, it's like, oh, that's nice. They came too. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I want to make a comment on here, but I'm seeing we've got a lot of countries come in on the map. Let's do a quick hit on that. I see we've got Canada, which is always great to get some of the big geographies, right? I know one of your favorites, Argentina down south, but in the U.S., we've got New Hampshire, Ohio, California, Oregon. We've also got mentioned Slovakia, got Germany, and another from Spain has come in as well. Mexico, Argentina. So appreciate all of that. And I'll let you get your obligatory food comment in there. India, that I failed to mention earlier, I think. But Jason, why is it you love Brazil and Argentina?
Because they know what to do with steak and wine. They just do. And I'm going to count on my friends from South Africa, just waking up a little bit late, but they're usually chiming in as well. And since I come from the great state of Texas, I should also give a hearty buenos dias to my neighbors to the south. I saw Mexico was in the list as well. So, Yeah, but let's go back to data because there's just some great stories to tell in this, right? So I love the fact there's those nice spreads, right? The first three plots are kind of nice, and then there's a pretty defined stagger that goes off of that. What I also think is really interesting, a lot of folks, you typically only think about the top five or the top six in there. There's a couple interesting pairings that we might want to explore as well over towards that left-hand side. Dave, you want to walk through a couple of those?
Yeah, and I'll actually toss it back to you because you had a good observation about, there's some vendors that are growing, some vendors are contracting. And, also I'll make this a point before I tee up on that there are some vendors that are very vocal in the market, then
Sure.
and as a startup, what you need to do is certainly exercise a lot of funds in the marketing and the brand awareness realm. What I find is amazing, if you kind of look on the right-hand side, the top four vendors account for just over 50% of the market.
Yeah.
And I've been following this particular Gartner circle or pie chart for quite some time, and the top three or four have always commanded 50% or more of the market. So despite new vendors, despite share shift that's taking place, it is overweighted towards a couple of vendors versus 20, 30 vendors. And pick your number, but it's been reported that throughout the history of backup, there's been well in excess of over 300 different backup companies that have been in the market. And yet what we see here, just looking at the top 15, the concentrations are pretty tight, to your point, Jason. But now let's let you make your comment over on the left-hand side.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that are interesting on the left when you look at and again, I'm not saying smaller as in diminutive or any way dismissive. I actually got to give some props out. So if you look in that far left-hand side, look at folks like Zerto, for example, right? That's a name that a lot of people hear about. So you got to give them great props on the marketing side of it. And yet they're commanding about 0.7% of market share. They are right next to adjacent to Micro Focus, right? So Micro Focus is the home of where HPE Data Protector went to go and reimagine itself. And so it's kind of interesting that as Zerto continues to go up market, Micro Focus continues to donate share back again to the rest of the market. I think it's interesting those are adjacent to each other. I think it's interesting that Cohesity, certainly one of the brands that a lot of folks look at a lot, is adjacent to and actually shares the same percentage as Quest. Right, Quest has been around for a very long time. They've got some interesting technologies, especially in the granular recovery elements. And again, I think that's kind of a pairing of one is coming and one is going, and yet their market share wise is sitting right next to each other. Dave, you bring up a really good point, though. I hadn't thought about when you look on the right hand side on those top four vendors. Right, that the three names that we've always called the enterprise trinity, right? So Veritas and Dell EMC and IBM, their sweet spot has always been the traditional raised floor monolithic data center, right? But that's not where major investment's going right now, right? I mean, everything we see says it's all about hybrid, it's all about multi-cloud, right? It's all around diversification of workloads. It's not about those blinky boxes on raised floor. So it's interesting that those three stalwarts continue to be on that right-hand side, but I think all three of them lost share over the last year.
Yeah, there's definitely share shift taking place. It's an interesting market because it continues to grow. It represents real spend when you get to close to $10 billion. And your point about hardware drag, meaning there's an ecosystem of, pick your number, but 30, 40 billion probably is no exaggeration. And that's annual, that's per year. Never mind what's already deployed and installed and maintenance contracts associated with that, et cetera. But there is share shift taking place. There are workloads that are moving. There are vendors that are kind of coming and going, to your point. And maybe let's look at the second slide. Now, the second one is from IDC, who's just in the process of updating their data. But this shows now first half of data. IDC publishes on a 6-month boundary. And one other difference is that IDC only names the top 5 vendors, unlike Gartner that names 15. But here, Veeam is listed at number 2, you can see. One of the things I like to point out, though, Jason, is I look at kind of health of business, and part of that's represented by year-over-year growth. Now, let's be fair. Commvault also grew year over year. And you can
Yep.
see the other three that are on the top five that are named. Veritas maybe about neutral, negative 0.1% is essentially neutral. And two others went back. IBM went back quite a ways. But Veeam actually grew 2.5 times greater than the only other named vendor that exhibited growth. So, from a health of business to strength or sort of amplitude of velocity there, you can see Veeam doing well. Market average, though, also did well. So, where there was growth, it wasn't in, to your point, Jason, it wasn't in kind of the traditional big enterprise three players, was it?
It wasn't. And again, let's go back to that trinity that we mentioned on the last slide, right? So Dell, Veritas, and IBM. It's the same trinity over here. You can tell them from all the red text on the right side of that chart, right? And so there is a donation that of market shift that goes through there. And again, they are certainly growing as a business, mostly I think because of the fact that if you had, let's say a petabyte within your enterprise data center, you're going to have storage growth. And if you're doing capacity-based licensing, you're going to grow by that percentage, because that way you don't have to change anything except your license count, right? And there's certainly an establishment for that. Certainly also, if you're doing perpetual licensing and you're on like a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year maintenance curve, you're going to let that stuff die and age out before you're swapping out. But beyond that, as we've seen, most of the growth in IT strategy right now is around embracing hybrid and multi-cloud, right?
Yep.
And so what we're seeing is most organizations, they are spinning up new workloads in these multi-hybrid cloud architectures faster than they are decommissioning their old workloads. And so what that means is you're going to see lift on the more modern data protection vendors, while simply just seeing renewals or deprecation on the more legacy vendors. And I think that's what you're seeing here in this chart is you've got your trinity, which are all eroding share. And then you've got those folks that aim in towards more modern, which includes Veeam. You ought to give props to Commvault, right? They're profitable, so they're in that space. And then other, right? I mean, so there's kind of those two bands. There's Veeam, Commvault, and other. And they're going up. Meanwhile, the Trinity goes down, and that's a reflecting share. But I love the fact that if you look at this on the right-hand side, the number that strikes me is 10x, or maybe it's 9x. Veeam year-over-year growth is 9x the market average. There's give and there's take, and there's Veeam. And I maybe that should be our new Twitter tagline. So, I don't know.
Yeah, and let's go back to one of the data points that you mentioned. You told people kind of mentally pin the Gartner 6.2% year over year growth in backup and replication software. Now maybe you can hit, but towards what end? Why?
Yeah, so remember, both the numbers that you've seen so far, those are reported numbers based on what happened in either calendar 2021, the Gartner numbers, or the first half of that. And certainly we hope to see the same kind of thing for the second half for IDC whenever that comes out as well. But this last number, this was actually from data that published in February of 2022. Surveyed back in November and December of 21, and the question was, how much do you expect your data protection budget to grow for calendar 2022, right? And Gartner said that they thought the next year was going to grow by 6.2%. 3,400 organizations from 28 countries around the world, when they answered this question, they said their data protection spend is going to grow from 5.9%. That's pretty darn freaking close, Dave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is. And we always love it when data agrees. It gives you more
Yeah.
confidence in the data. And obviously, Gartner used their methodology to come up with their forecast. We came up with, you used our own, and you mentioned 3,400 people, approximately 28 countries now, looking at different ways of trying to triangulate on what we think the market's doing. I love how you broke this out. Let's first take maybe geography, and is before we go and look at the map is why I have that on my mind. What I think is interesting is North America, of the four major geos listed, actually has the smallest on average increase in backup spend as compared to other areas, and LATAM actually has the highest.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy to me. And again, this is one of the reasons why that when Veeam goes to independent research companies, in this case, I think this data came from Vance and Bourne, right? And so when we go out and they ask them to go ask these questions to go figure this out. So this is not Veeam customers. This is 3,400 unbiased organizations, most of them rather large. When we do this in 28 different countries, I do think that's interesting, especially when you think about, certainly the U.S., predominantly the North American spend is typically the leader in most technology areas, right? And so one would presume that they are highly investing in hybrid and multi-cloud architectures. You got to know that you got to back that stuff up along the way. And yet you do see a disproportionate shift there. And I do think that's going to affect the competitive landscape, because every other data protection vendor in our space, predominantly they are US companies that also sell in rest of world. Veeam is an international company that also sells in the US. I mean, it's not quite that diametrically opposed, but the fact that we are typically even higher in market share in even the other parts of the world shows that where we are strong, they are even spending more. Where there's other companies that are U.S. centric, that spend is not going to go as far. We might actually see that gap widen a little bit more as the Trinity continues to erode, and while the others are not able to make up that ground.
Yeah, great point in terms of where the market's actually moving and which geography is leading the charge. Towards that end, let's hit the map one more time, because there's been a ton of activity that's come in on that I can see. We've got a few more states in the U.S., Tennessee, Florida. Do also want to call out, we've got in Europe, we've got Netherlands, Romania, a few from Germany. Turkey has also come in as well. And then if you look in Africa, we've got quite the contingent this Monday. We've got Madagascar, Nigeria, Zambia, and Bahrain over in the Middle East as well. So thank you very much for that and for tuning in. But, Jason, I liked, your point where you were going with, in some cases, it could be that certain areas in the past have underinvested. And in some cases, what this means for some of the suppliers is if they are geographically overexposed in certain areas, some of those things we saw from a Gartner and an IDC perspective, and in the next few weeks, we should get updated ICC numbers so we can kind of pin this as a hypothesis that we'll later look to prove or disprove with real data. And that shift, that notion of things are changing, it's not a static market, I think we're going to continue to see amplified.
Yeah, the only other thing I can think about for more the North American market is you often will see where organizations will modernize production at a faster rate than they're modernizing protection. And certainly in the US market, we are on the bleeding edge of so many hybrid cloud type architectures. I think this is where you're going to see more around like serverless. Kubernetes is inordinately more deployed in US organizations than it is in the rest of the world, because that tends to be a leading edge along the way. And so what happens, kind of like Office and Microsoft 365, right? So you modernize from on-prem Exchange and SharePoint into SaaS, and it took you a year and a half to figure out the recycle bin is not enough. And then you got to catch up and start bolting on data protection that goes along with that. So it might just be where that curve is. They're still in the spend on modernization of production, which means we should see the U.S. investment increment. That balloon will come in the second wave for 23 as opposed to 22. But Dave, let's do some myth busting, because the other side of that, let's look at that left table as well. We cut the same data, same question, but we're cutting it by all the different segments. And in this case, you don't really see a balloon, right? I mean, there's a little bit of a spike, but that basically, it doesn't tell a story. It just means 3,400 companies, they're all thinking the same way, regardless of size.
Yeah, it really does, and which I find fascinating, because what it says is, mid-size enterprise, small enterprise, large, very, very large enterprise, everybody's investing further, investing more. And if I piggyback off what you mentioned around, oftentimes you modernize production first, then you look at your secondary, your backup, your replication, disaster recovery. But in this case, regardless of what kind of organization you may be, And it's true from a geographic perspective, but it's even more accurate, to your point, from a headcount or number of employees. If you state the converse, there is nobody that's not looking at protecting their data more in the upcoming year than they have in the past.
That's exactly right. And in fact, even we just go back to the main chart on this, right? So what do we got? 9 and 2 is 11, 1 is 12. So 88%, 7 out of 8 organizations plan on increasing their spend in data protection for 2022 over what they did in 2021. Contrary to that, only 3% say they're going to spend less. 3%. And they're not going to spend less than the roll that through. It's 6 1/3. So 3% are going to spend 6% less. And then 88% are on average going to spend exorbitantly more.
And I couldn't help get out the calculator on that. So 3% of 3,393, Jason, that means I'll round up. 102 organizations out of almost 3,400 say backup's not really all that important. Our data is really not all that important. Nothing really ever goes wrong. Ransomware is kind of a thing of the past. However, the other 3,000, almost 300, are thinking a little differently.
You know what I got to do afterwards, because you've not shared that data with me before. I love how whenever we do this, there's always that next layer in the onion. I'm going to go find out where those 100 organizations are on the geographic spend. My guess is most of them are in the U.S. market, and that pulled down the North American number on that right-hand side. 100 folks out of the 800 and some odd that were representative of the North American sample within the 3,400. That might be how that 5.0 pulls out is.
Yeah,
maybe it's
that
a
will be
vertical.
interesting.
Maybe it's a segment. But my guess is most of them are American.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, let's put a pin in that. Let's put a pin in the upcoming second half IDC data for 2021 that we expect shortly, and see if fresh data or a deeper lens on that bears out some of our hypotheses. As we wind down, Jason, conference season's coming up. Veeam On is coming up. We're going to be back in person as well as continuing our hybrid event as well. So we'll be back in Las Vegas, and we'll be also offering it at no charge from a virtual perspective as well. So that's going to be on May 16th and 19th in Vegas, as well as virtual, a number of sessions for you there. Speaking of number of sessions and things coming up, we're going to do something a little unusual. Tomorrow, we're going to be live streaming from VMUG. And we're going to have our own Corinne Bissett, technologist on a product strategy team. She's going to be hosting Ariel Sanchez Mora, tech account manager from VMware, along with Brad Tompkins, VMUG executive director. So we'll do a live from the field, speaking of returning back to live events. And then this Friday, our pals Rick Vanover, Melissa Palmer are going to be double-clicking on 22 reasons why you should check out Veeam On. And if you can't attend it in person, again, just a quick shout out. It's virtually held as well at zero cost. So always like to use the phrase, Jason, you owe it to yourself to go check out something, learn a few new things, get informed. And if you're not able to travel, no problem. We got you covered.
That's right. That's right. I think you and I actually both have both virtual sessions and physical sessions on our own calendars. So going to be a very busy week. I will say I've just started having those first in-person events again. I had forgotten how much I missed in-person meetings at scale. So really looking forward to the Veeam On event. Hope to see several of y'all on there.
Yeah, well said. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on episode 91 next week.
91.